Hello everyone, I'm Anas Al-Ubaidi and this is lecture 14 or session 14 within chapter 20 of the Advanced Medical Science Liaison and Medical Monitor Certification course program by CCRPS. As the chapter is about the specialized monitoring techniques, while the title or the topic for this session is about the monitoring of behavioral and surgical trials. Introduction. Behavioral and surgical trials stand apart from traditional clinical studies due to their unique challenges and complexities. These trials are essential for refining innovative non pharmacological interventions and surgical techniques, contributing significantly to contemporary medical advancements. Behavioral trials often focus on interventions such as psychotherapy, lifestyle modifications, and counseling, which require subjective outcome measures, placing significant emphasis on standardization and fidelity of intervention delivery. The key points here will start with the challenges. The challenges in monitoring behavioral and surgical trials. In behavioral trials, the challenges in monitoring, as behavioral trials investigate non-drug interventions focused on lifestyle, therapy, or counseling impacts. Their monitoring requires particular attention to subjective outcomes and ethical complexities. The subjective outcome measurement, the reliance the reliance on self-reported data in behavioral trials is a significant challenge. Questionnaires and scales may lack precision despite validation. So that's why we'll have having as a main challenge, one of the main challenge or common challenges in monitoring for behavioral trials that we might face is subjective outcome measurement. As for example, using the Big Depression Inventory, BDI, in trials evaluating cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, effectiveness for depression requires stringent monitoring of consistent questionnaire administration. Another challenge in monitoring in behavioral trials, we have adverse event definition. Unlike drug trials, behavioral interventions often lack well-defined criteria for adverse events, AEs, especially in psychological contexts, as for example, temporary stress or emotional distress during exposure therapy for anxiety disorders must be objectively tracked and monitored systematically. And prior to proceeding, here we have a summarized diagram that is summarizing the challenges in behavioral trials as we have subjective outcomes and we have ethical complexities. Continuing furthermore within challenges, and still in the challenges in monitoring in the behavioral trials, we have protocol compliance variability, as behavioral interventions depend heavily on facilitators, creating risks for subtle deviation from protocols, which may compromise consistency. As solution resolution for that, implement regular training and standardization exercises for all therapists or counselors involved in the trial. Another challenge within uh, uh, the behavioral trials that the monitoring might face, or the monitoring approach might face, is ethical challenges, as sensitive populations such as individuals with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or caregivers of Alzheimer's patients require particularly careful consent processes and ethical oversight, as for example, ensuring informed consent protocols address subjects' vulnerability and capacity to participate fully informed. Now we have the challenges in monitoring in surgical trials, particularly as surgical trials evaluate technologies, procedures, or therapeutic devices that carry invasive risks and operational complexity. As one of the challenges, we'll start with variability in surgical technique. outcomes may be influenced by the experience, training, and preferences of individual surgeons. As, for example, trials comparing robotic assisted laparoscopic surgeries to traditional open procedures must address variations in surgeon skill. Another challenge in the monitoring or might monitor faces and surgical trials, blinding difficulties, as blinding is often impossible in surgical trials, leaving room for subjective bias from both patients and surgeons. As, for example, addressing operative wounds uniformly in randomized trials helps reduce patient bias by concealing the type of surgery. Furthermore, the learning curve effect, the surgeon's improvement with repeated procedures can skew the early data collection. As, for example, including a run-in phase for practice cases ensures more standardized mastery before prior to outcome collection begins. Risk management monitoring must focus on procedures specific complications like bleeding or infection, solution resolution for that, early adverse event tracking, and systematized intervention plans are critical to efficient and ethical trial management. Patient preference and equipoise or equipoise. Patients often have preferences in surgical versus non surgical options, blurring randomization and influencing outcomes. The key takeaway here from both the challenges in monitoring for both surgical and behavioral trials, acknowledging and addressing the challenges with systematic approaches ensures consistency, safety, and trial integrity. Now we have the best practices in behavioral and surgical trial monitoring. In behavioral trials, we'll start with precise adverse event reporting, AE reporting. Develop structured protocols that capture all adverse events, AEs, even if mild or transient, such as acute stress reactions. As, for example, create logs for monitoring participant reported feelings of discomfort, noting intensity and duration. Standardization across facilitators, thoroughly trained therapists and facilitators to deliver interventions consistently across trial sites. As for example, use a pre-designed scripts for the therapeutic sessions in cognitive behavioral therapy (CBT) research. Rigorous in-term analysis, and in-term here meaning ongoing. Still, the terminology in term we use in the clinical research for any outcomes coming or data coming or analysis being done while that certain particular trial is still ongoing, has not been closed yet. So rigorous in-term analysis, frequent monitoring ensures early detection of safety issues and allows dynamic adjustments. An independent data and safety monitoring board, for short DSMB, should review in-term reports. Prior to continuing here, take a look here at this diagram summarizing the components of behavioral trials, as we have the informing interventions, observing behaviors, analyzing results, and measuring behaviors. Continuing furthermore, within the best practices in behavioral trials, we have recruitment precision. Strict screening ensures that enrolled participants meet inclusion guidelines, minimizing confounding variables. Now we have the best practices in surgical trials. Operational protocol credentials. Select experienced clinical sites with surgeons already credentiated or credentialed for the trial's specific technique. So the credentials for the surgeons who are involved in such trials. As, for example, require surgeons to complete simulation-based training certifications before or prior to participating in robotic surgery trials. Another best practice, blinded assessments When possible, employ independent blinded assessors to evaluate outcomes like symptom scores or aesthetic results post surgery. Simulator training pre-trial reduce variability by mandating surgical procedure walkthroughs on simulators prior to before the trial begins, as for example, test surgeon competence with a minimum of 10 simulated laparoscopic surgeries. Another best practice: comprehensive data collection capture detailed intraoperative metrics such as surgical times, blood loss, and surgical decision-making notes for robust analysis. The key takeaway here from the best practices that apply for both behavioral and surgical trials as training, proactive monitoring, and standardization are pivotal to overcoming inherent uh, complexities in behavioral and surgical trials. Now we have the advances in monitoring techniques, as several cutting edge advancements have revolutionized behavioral and surgical trial monitoring, enhancing precision and reducing resource requirements. And here we'll start with the wearable tech or wearable technologies or wearable devices. As devices measure physiological and behavioral processes in real time, so whenever we hear wearable technology or wearable device, then we are talking about the real-time data capture, right? The real-time data capture, and it is important always to link those two aspects together. So, real time, particularly valuable in post-operative or behavioral trial tracking. Example: monitoring step counts with pedometers and behavioral interventions promoting physical activity among sedentary adults. Another advancement in monitoring technology is surgical robotics incorporation. Robotic systems reduce manual variability in clinical settings. And here we have a diagram, a summarized diagram that is summarizing or explaining or clarifying the advances in monitoring technologies, as we have enhanced precision, reduced resource requirements, and wearable technologies. Continuing with the advances, as EPRO, uh, which is the electronic patient or participant reported outcome systems, real-time data input by patients or participants allows streamlined tracking and oversight. As for example, behavioral studies use e-diaries, electronic diaries, to capture mood progression metrics during therapy sessions. VR virtual reality simulations. VR virtual reality tools allow surgeons to rehearse rare or complex scenarios pre-trial, minimizing variability. As for example, VR virtual reality simulations have been widely adapted for trauma surgery rehearsals. Real-time dashboards. Centralized dashboards facilitate monitoring all trial sites, flagging deviations or delays immediately for resolution. And here the key takeaway from the advances: employing advanced tools strengthens monitoring methods and adds efficiency in high complexity trials. Next, we have tables that will be summarizing what we have covered. To summarize what we have covered through this lecture, as here we have table on applications for mastery level practices, monitoring focus, and then application. As the monitoring focuses are blinded outcome assessments, wearable integration, standardized pre-trial training, adaptive monitoring programs. Table on behavioral trial challenges. As the challenge explanation, example, impact, recommendation, and the challenges we have in monitoring and behavioral trials, we have subjective outcomes, variability in execution, adverse event AE reporting ethical concerns, or participant engagement. Another table on best practices as field best practice implementation, key benefit challenges addressed. Fields, we have AE reporting precision, AE for adverse event, intervention standardization, surgical skill alignment, regular data and safety monitoring board review, DSMB review, recruitment precision. Table on regulatory considerations, aspect, requirement, trial type, impacted, implementation example, and then outcome. Aspects, we have ethical approvals, GCP good clinical practice compliance, device regulations, adverse event reporting, and registry inclusion. We have table on recent advancements as the advancement, the purpose, the example, benefits, limitations. Advancements, we have real-time e-diaries, electronic diaries, surgical robotics, wearables, virtual reality, VR training platforms, psychotherapy apps. Another table on applications for mastery technique, application example, key outcome, benefits, challenges. As techniques, we have standardized skills, simulator-based training, adaptive AE adverse event, log systems, multi-site oversight boards, advanced participant onboarding. The application table. As here we have scenarios. For each scenario, key principle applied, key actions, timeline, what to watch out for. Scenarios, we have behavioral trial assessing as cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Surgical trial comparing laparoscopic versus open procedures, behavioral interventions for reducing sedentary behavior. Neurosurgery trial evaluating robotic assisted techniques. Behavioral trial for Alzheimer's caregiver stress reduction, surgical trial evaluating implantable cardiac devices, PTSD as for post-traumatic stress disorder therapy trial for veterans, post-op recovery monitoring with wearables. Continuing with scenarios, multi-site trial testing manual versus robotic surgery, behavior change program for diabetes management. Then we will be revising what we have covered through this lecture via some MCQs or multiple choice questions. Question 1. What is a key challenge in monitoring behavioral trial outcomes? A. Ensuring consistency in surgical techniques. B. Managing self-reported subjective outcomes. C. Monitoring medical device performance. Or D. Adherence to pharmacological treatment protocols. So we are taking key challenge. We are talking about the key challenge in monitoring in behavioral trial. And as we said in behavioral trial, one of the main challenges is the subjective outcomes. So is B is the answer as managing self-reported subjective outcomes, as behavioral trials often rely on participants' self-reported outcomes such as mood improvement or stress reduction, which may introduce variability and subjectivity, necessitating robust and standardized measurement tools. Question 2. Why is the surgical learning curve a challenge in surgical trials? A. It causes surgeons to adapt different procedural techniques. B. It risks unreported postoperative complications. C. Surgeons improve with practice, influencing early trial data. Or D. It prevents blinding in surgical interventions. So as long as we are talking here about the surgical learning curve as a challenge in surgical trials for surgeons, so as long as learning curve, so here surgeons would improve. There will be improvement. So C is the answer as surgeons improve with practice influencing early trial data. That's why it's a challenge and improvement at the same time. So learning curve, what that would create a challenge in such trials, which are the surgical trials, as surgeons improve due to the surgical learning curve, but will end up having a challenge, which is influencing early trial data. So a surgeon's technique tends to improve with repeated procedures, which can skew data collected during the early phases of the trial, potentially impacting the interpretation, it means the data interpretation of outcomes. Question 3. What is a recommended best practice for mitigating AE tracking issues in behavioral behavioral trials. So A, rely solely on participant interviews. B, use structured protocols to capture all adverse events. C, delegate monitoring entirely to site therapists. Or D, ignore transit emotional responses during therapy. So the best recommended practice within the four choices in order to track AE, mitigating or managing AE, adverse event tracking, issues or problems in particularly behavioral trials, is to use structured protocols to capture all AEs, as B is the answer. Employing clear structured protocols enables comprehensive tracking of both serious and non-serious adverse events, AEs, ensuring trials maintain patient safety and regulatory compliance. Question 4. Which method helps minimize variability in surgical trial procedural outcomes? A, allowing surgeons to use preferred techniques. B, conducting no pre-study training. C, simulator training before or prior to trial initiation. Or D, removing blinding requirements from site protocols. So, which method helps supports the idea of minimizing variability in surgical trial procedural outcomes? So, definitely allowing surgeons to use preferred techniques is not the choice, as surgeons, as PIs, they need to go, or even sub investigators, if they are sub investigators, they need to go per protocol, whatever this technique decided per the trial. Conducting no pre-study training does not make any sense, as training as a pre-study or prior to study training is essential for surgical trials. Removing blinding requirements doesn't apply for the purpose or doesn't fit for the purpose of minimizing variability. So what's remain is C, as C is the most accurate answer. Simulator training, simulations before or prior to trial initiation. So C is the answer. A simulation-based training standardizes surgical techniques, reducing variability caused by differing skill levels or approaches among surgeons in the trial. Question 5. How can participant bias in surgical trials be minimized effectively? A, using independent postoperative outcome assessors. B, allowing patients to choose their intervention type. C, avoiding the collection of blinding related data. Or D, increasing the frequency of on-site audits. So increasing frequency of on-site audits doesn't help to minimize uh, participant bias in surgical trials. But although audit might be required, but not increasing frequency is not the solution. Avoiding the collection of blinding related data is not the resolution, or not the method. Allowing patients or participants to choose their intervention type, this mostly never will be a choice for any advancement or approach in clinical research, as the participant they cannot, as the patients or who are participant, they cannot choose their intervention type. All has to be done per protocol. So what's left is A, as A is the most reasonable answer, using independent post-operative outcome assessors, as for instance the data and safety monitoring boards, DSMB for short, as it is a board that works independently to analyze data and outcomes as well. So A is the answer. Employing and blinded assessors to evaluate trial outcomes ensures unbiased and standardized assessment, especially critical in surgical trials where participant and surgeon blinding is often challenging. And here we come to end of this lecture. Thank you very much and goodbye.